Good morning, everybody. Welcome to class this morning. As we get started today, I want to thank you for tuning in and watching, whether you're watching live or watching recorded. I appreciate you taking the time to get engaged and get involved in this material. We're talking about forms this week. And in talking about forms, there's a lot to do with forms. So, in the interest of not wanting to go too long in this live stream and to kind of spread things out and, approach some things differently, what I think I might do is, in addition to this live stream, just so I can keep this just a little bit shorter, post some supplementary material, some things that I've made before as well, when I post the recording of this live stream. Just so you can kind of divide up your time a little better looking at all this stuff and working on, getting forms ready to use on your website. And really, in addition to the list, right, when we looked at lists the other week, we saw how versatile and useful lists are. And in addition to the list, I'd say that the form is one of the most versatile website elements that we can use. And that's why we do form elements as their own thing. We can look at forms, we can look at lists as their own thing, just because they are so versatile. There's so much we can do with these elements. And, as you progress, especially when we get into interactivity, you'll discover that forms and form elements are super important in terms of how we allow our users to interact with us and give us information, receive information from us, all this other sorts of stuff that, is really an interactive thing. But today we're talking about forms, and in talking about forms, I think we need to start out with a definition. Just what exactly are forms? And in talking about forms in this sort of way, we're talking about forms the way you encounter forms every single day of your life. Really, there's not very often, especially in the professional world, where I don't see some kind of form come in front of me, even if it's just something as simple as, put your name here, put your email address here. That's still a form. Like this morning, I had to go doing a key inventory audit at the college here just to make sure everybody's got the right keys, everybody's got the keys that they need for classrooms and offices and things like that. And I got my keys inventoried, and they wrote down my information in a form. And, we're used to using forms. So we can take what we know about how we use forms in the real world and parlay that into what we need to know about forms online, on web pages. Forms are an essential part of the internet. We see them everywhere. Even something as simple as logging in, which you probably had to log into Blackboard this morning, or you might have had to log into YouTube. Even something that is just as simple as username, password, click, that's a form. It's ubiquitous on the internet. They give us a way to capture information and to process requests. And they give us controls for nearly every imaginable use of an application. So we get that big part of interactivity here. So a form doesn't just have to be a long job application type, super, here's 50 form fields to fill out. It can just be something that's as simple as username, password, submit, you're in. Right? All of these qualify as forms. And so that's the what of forms. We can take what we know about forms in the regular world and parlay that into the internet. So what about why we use forms? So one of the big things here in understanding why we use forms is to be able to acquire user input. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss how we use HTML to mark up a form, to create a form. And then we'll also use, we'll talk about like how to style forms with CSS and all this other kind of stuff, even though it's basically, the same types of stuff that you've been doing already with CSS. The same kind of stuff applies. Background color and all that kind of fun stuff. So we're going to be looking at the front end of form development, the form pieces that you actually see on the website. What we won't be talking about is the back end, how forms are processed and handled, because that's outside of the scope of this course. Right, introduction to markup and scripting is HTML, CSS, JavaScript. When you get into form processing and form handling, you're getting into server-side languages. And that's going to extend, in most cases, past JavaScript. So when you get into some more advanced classes down the way, when you get into things like your content management system classes and database-driven websites and things of that nature, you'll talk about form handling and how we take forms and pass it on to the next thing. So right now we're not getting too deep into the handling of the information on a form. We just want to talk about form creation, how we make a form itself. Because, that's form processing is a much deeper process. So to add a form to a page, we use our form element. And this form element is essentially our container for all of our other form pieces. Right? We've talked about the DOM before. And we've talked about how, when we create things in this sort of tree structure or this sort of container structure. And so everything that belongs to that goes inside of it. And so our form element is essentially our base container structure for our form. So any of the form stuff that we need to be a part of our form that we're using, we're going to put inside of this element. And we can give ourselves a handful of attributes to our form. The most common are action and method. And action and method are processing attributes. They help to tell our code how to process this form. So we won't get too much into our action and method attributes here. The action contains the URL to which the information included within the form will be sent. And then the method is for whether you want to do, put data or, how we want to actually send that data across our website. So when it comes to method and form, or method and action rather, as a part of our form, these are all processing bits, so we're not going to get into them. But we will kind of put them in our markup just so we can see where they go and have an understanding so we can kind of keep that in our back pockets for later. But when we initialize a form, it looks a little something like this. You can see here that we have our form tags, and they're going to be our container for our form. And we have our action here. That action is going to be the page that resides the code for our data processing. So in this case, it's going to be some kind of login page. And the method is going to be the post method. With forms, there are two primary types of methods for processing the data. We have our get method and our post method. And I can talk about this really quickly, just kind of as an aside. As we kind of get started. When it comes to get, what get does is gets used to request data from a specified source. So it's going to take the data from the form and do something with it. One of the interesting things about that is it usually puts these little data points in the URL of a GET request. So like if you see a site that's using the GET method, you'll notice that in the URL after you've pressed the submit button or whatever, you'll see up there the information that you typed into the form. So the GET requests are actually cached inside of the browser. They're in your browser history. Whereas with a POST method, which is, the most common thing, because it's way more secure than a GET method, because they're not cached, they're stored, server side. You can't bookmark them, you can't save them to your history states or anything like that. So the POST method is much more secure than a GET method. There are other methods that you could use. Put is another method. There's a head method, several other methods. But by and large, what you'll be seeing is POST methods utilized for data form processing on websites. Doesn't really mean a whole lot to us now since we're not going to be getting deep into that. Just thought I would give us an aside there and talk about that for a minute. So we have these actions and we have these methods here in our example, but they don't have to be there. They only need to be there if we're going to be processing that form. So I'd like for you to see that here so you can see where these things go. They go as attributes in our opening form tag. But for our purposes, we actually won't be using these in our code because we're not sending our form data anywhere. We're not actually processing that form data. So if I fire up my REPL, to start my form, I'm just going to add my form opening tag and my form closing tag. And this establishes my container for all of my other form elements that are going to go in here. And you can see on its own down here in our output window, the form tag on its own does absolutely nothing, but it is a container. So if we focused some CSS on that element selector, we can give it a width of, say, 800 pixels. We could give it a height of, I'll say 500 pixels for the time being. Let's change that to a min height, min-dash height. That way when we add more elements later on, we won't have to go back and change that. And let's just give it a background color. Background color. Let's make it like a seafoam green. Just because I kind of like that color today. So let's go AA. G will be FF. B will be CC. Nice light green, kind of a seafoamy green. Why not? And then we can center that up with a margin 0 auto. So it is a container element, just like a div element. On its own, it doesn't do anything, although we can add some styling rules to our form tag to make it present. So we can actually see that on the screen if we want to. And this will also, just give our form a little background. If we want to have a nice background that's specifically for our form. So it's just as simple as that. Next up, we have our text fields. And this is our most common input type, right? Are these text fields. They're widely used. You see them everywhere. Like your username and password submissions, those are text field submissions. And with this, we're using our input element. And our input element is going to be used a lot, right? We use the same element for a lot of our form fields. What we do is we just change the attribute that goes along with that element. So in this case, we're talking specifically about our input element. And we have a lot of type attributes that we could put on this input element. And so input type equals text is one of those. So when we look at this as a code example, we have several things we could do here. We want to give our form field a type. Right? In this case, it's a text box, so it should be type text. And we're going to give it a name, and this name can be whatever we want it to be. And for our purposes here, the name isn't quite as important. But when we're processing our form, that name is going to be way more important, and we want to include that name. You know, we want each of our input fields to have a unique name so that when we're passing our data forward, everything is unique and everything has its own values. Something else that we want to add here that we're not adding in this code example is some kind of ID selector. And what we can do here is we can just give it the same name as the name attribute for our form field, right? Because we want them to be, we want our name to be unique. We want our ID to be unique and not used by anything else. So if they're both a unique identifier for this one particular element, you can use the same thing for both. So if I'm making a form field here, I'm going to write input type equals text, name equals username, ID equals username. And one of the things about our input field that's different from a lot of our other elements that we've discussed is that this is a self-closing field. So I'm going to end this with a / greater than. And that's going to give me my input field. We have it here. I can click into it. I can type things into it. I can do whatever I want to do there. And we can style this likewise. We can style it directly by highlighting that ID selector. So that's #username. And I can give it a width. And I can give it a height. I can even change the background color if I want to. So maybe I want to make it a darker version of this green here. Maybe I want to do something like a, I don't know, one one 77 55. I'll make the font color a white. So then if I were to type in there and type, my font color is white now. You can make it font family. Sans serif. Font size. We can make that big, 24 pixels. We'll have to increase the height here. We'll increase the height to 32 pixels. And we have an interesting little form field. We can give it a little bit of margin. Let's make it like margin 12, px auto. So it's 12 down from the top and then centered. Oh, that is right. When I'm working with form fields are treated a little bit differently. Well, we can just give it a little bit of information here. And there we have ourselves a little text box. And it's a little different, you know. By default, it gives us that little white text box. But we can use CSS and we can change that and we can make it whatever we want, right? That's one of the beneficial parts about why we do this. And one of the things that we'll talk about, and I guess, you know what, we could probably just go ahead and talk about it, is our label. So we can put a label on everything. And labels provide captions or little headings for form controls. So this unambiguously ties them together and it creates an accessible form for all of our users. So we have this form and this label that's tied directly to this form. And so if I'm using this form, if I'm a blind user and need a screen reader to access the material or whatever we need to do, right? What I might do is I might add a label to a form element. And I can do that by creating a label element and tying it to the ID for the element that we're working with. You know, that's going to look a little something like this, right? We have a label here for username. And it says for username, and that's going to relate to this ID of username. So in our instance, and what we're working with here, what we're doing is exactly the same as this. So I can create a label to go along with this. Label. Then we can set the for equals username. Because that for ties to this ID selector. And we just say username and close that label. And so now we have a little username label here that's at the beginning of our form field. And we can do a little bit of styling here with this. For example, you know, what we might want to do instead of putting our sans serif here in our font family, what we might want to do instead is put it in our universal asterisk selector. So if we use our asterisk selector and put font family, sans serif, like that. We can put a little padding on our form, right? Padding, maybe like 12 pixels, just to bring that in from the edges a little bit. You know, do the whole box sizing, border box thing. Like that. And we have a form field now that we can use. That's a part of our form, and it looks nice, and it's accessible because it's tied directly to the form field itself and all that kind of stuff. You know, this is proper technique. So in addition to these particular text fields here, we also have all kinds of other types of inputs here that we could use. You know, text we can use for everything. Text can be kind of a catch-all, but we have other input types that we could use for more specific elements. And these actually provide us a clearer semantic meaning for these different input types, and it also helps certain users with their input based on what they can add to the form, which is pretty interesting, right? It actually kind of changes the interaction with the text box, and we'll see that in just a minute. Well, we have all of these different types here. Color, which is actually a color picker that you can add to your site. Date gives you those little date selector situations with the calendar. Date, time, email, month, number, range. And a lot of these will look like text boxes, things like email and number and telephone. They'll look like text boxes. Well, one of the great parts here is for input validation. If you have a text field that is set up as an email input type, and a user enters something into it that doesn't have email formatting, it'll say, nope, this isn't right. This isn't what's supposed to be in here. I'm looking for an email. I'm an email input type. So let's just add a couple of these to our form that we're working on here, just so we can see them. Let's start off by adding let's start off by adding a password input type, which is interesting. So let's do input, and actually probably what we would want to do here is just copy and paste this, right? One of the things that we can do is we can let our past successes help us with our future successes. So if I know I want pretty much the exact same thing, I can just do this and I can change some things. So I'm going to say password here, password here, password here as the username, as the name, and password here as the ID. And we'll also change the value of the label to password. Now, the interesting thing about this here, as we can see, right, the formatting's reverted back to default. We have a text box here. I can add this password styling here and go comma, password, and it'll add that password ID to that styling. But check out what happens when I start to type in here. I'm typing letters. I'm typing all sorts of letters. But instead of the letters, you see those little dots. You see those little asterisks. Those, that obfuscation, right? Like if I just go in here and I start typing the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you don't see that here. You just see dot, 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 dot. And that's one of the benefits that this password type gives us. When it sends this information off, it's going to send off the actual word that was typed in there. It's just obfuscating it between what's in there now and what is shown. And so you might have thought this was really hard to do when you like enter a password into a password field on a website and it stars it out or dots it out like this. But it's actually really quite simple because all we're doing here is we're just using the type of password instead of type of text. Another thing that I could do here would be a type of date. So I'm just going to take that, copy it, paste that in there. Maybe I want this to be birthday, right? So we'll call this one birthday. We'll give it the ID of birthday, the name of birthday, and the type of date. Now let's see what happens here. Whoa. You just saw it change right before your eyes. Right? And so instead of password, this will be date of birth. No complex coding, right? No fancy stuff. Just entered in the type of date. I could even add this if I wanted to this other styling that we have here. So comma, hashtag, birthday. And it gets its own styling as well. And you can see this is the pop-up calendar that you get on certain sites. So I can click this calendar here. And it'll pop myself up a calendar where I can select a date, whether I want it to be today or sometime in the future. And it's going to auto-populate that field for me. And that's really, really good. Right, and all of these have their different advantages and different things that you can take advantage of versus another one. Right, one more that I like to do is I like to do the color picker. So we'll paste this in here one more time. We'll change some stuff to like, favorite color. This will be a label for color. The ID will be color. The name will be color. And the input type will be color. Now let's watch what happens here. Wow. Let's put in a little line break here to get it down on its own line. You can see there we have a very different looking input here. And it's a color picker. Like I can click that little box there and it's going to pop me up a little color picker. And the look of this color picker is going to vary based on which browser I'm using and all this kind of stuff. I'm in Chrome now, so this is what my color picker looks like. And I can pick a color here. And we can change different color types between HSL and hex and RGB. And I've actually used this before to make a little proof of concept, like, when you pick a color, it'll, change the background color and then change some foreground color stuff to be like the opposite of that color and just have some good times with it. But this could also just be something that you use, if you were developing like a personal tool type of website. You could just have yourself a color picker right on there, which is interesting. And we could also style this in the same sort of way. Like it'll look a little goofy if I went up here and did that. It might look a little goofy. Actually, I think that looks kind of all right. See how close we can get. Pretty close. Pretty close. Gives us our color picker. And so in the module, you'll read more about some of the other ones. And you'll read a little bit about how we use these to kind of handle input and input validation, which is going to be important. Like if I have an email field, for example, what I might do is I might use email as my type. And it's, again, it's going to give us the same type of input text box, and it's going to let us input text. But instead of just getting whatever text is put in there, it's going to be looking for text in an email format, which is pretty interesting. And so there we just have some more examples of that. You can pause on that if you need to right there and just look through those. We just did a few examples though, so I think we're good. This is to show you how things are different, right? Like we looked at that date picker in Google, in Chrome, and we saw how it looked in Chrome, and we saw how the color picker looked in Chrome. But that's going to vary depending on the browser you're in and depending on the operating system you're in. Like if you use that date picker in an iOS environment, you get one of the scrolling wheel situations here that looks like this. Right? You're using that same form field. It just looks different because it's on a different environment. The next thing that we can talk about is the text area. And so where our text input is for a single line of text, our text area is for like a paragraph or multiple lines of text. So our text area is going to span multiple lines. It's for larger passages of text. And unlike our input tags, these are actually, we're back to paired tags here. We have an opening text area element and a closing text area element tag. And we actually don't even use an attribute selector here at all. You know, we can use an ID or whatever, you know, and we can add our label with that. But other than that, we wouldn't need any other kind of attributes. So it's just going to look like this. Text area, name, equals comment, add your comment here, so on and so forth. And so if we pass over to our REPL that we've been working on here, and we can add a text area. And I'm going to bring a label into this because I want a label. And this will be my label for message. We'll call my text area message. We'll give it the ID of message. And we'll say your message. Now I can add my text area. Text area ID equals message. And we'll close that text area. And you can see here we get this little text message, this text box area, and by default we actually have this little corner here that we can drag and make bigger inside of our page. If we want to resize this by default when it shows up on the page, we can add that into our CSS. So maybe I want to make it, you know, green and everything else like what we've done so far. I can add our hashtag message here. And I can give it some other styling and do kind of what I want to do with it as we kind of progress here. You know, I can make it its own element here, hashtag message, and give it its own height to make it different. HEIGHT, 400 pixels, whatever we want to do here. We can add a little line break here. We can add a little line break here. So we get this sort of formatting, you know, the way that we want to do it. You know, this message, I can just type a message. I can type it as long as I want, as many words as I want, and it'll just text wrap and go around, which is pretty cool. Now, obviously here, I haven't really been paying attention to like my widths and my heights. Like if you want to like make this more well-designed, right, you're going to want to do some positioning. You're going to want to do, you know, pay more attention to your widths, pay more attention to your heights. So you have things nice and lined up and all this kind of stuff. And so what I think I'm going to do is I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap the live stream up just a little early, because we could talk about form elements all day, right? But I think I kind of just want to kind of wrap this up here to where we're just looking at our text input elements in our live stream. So I'll post some other stuff that looks at things like our radio buttons and our checkboxes. I'll post some other stuff that looks at, you know, some more styling in depth and all that kind of stuff, so that you can have that alongside of this material here. You know, this is something that, you know, like we said, like forms are so versatile that we could get on forms and talk about forms for, you know, hours and hours and hours and hours. So what I think I'll do in order for the interest of time here is go ahead and stop our live stream here so that we have our, just our text inputs isolated in our live stream forum discussion here. So you'll get this along with some additional material when I release the recording in the Blackboard class. And I'll also give you this little demo file and, whatever else. So that's all that I have for you for today. I'll hang out in the chat for just a couple minutes just to see if anybody here has any questions before I end the stream. But again, that's all that I have for you for today. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.